All right. Well, tonight we're going to be discussing pastoral care for displaced persons. So, if you go on social media today, you will find that many Americans have a problem with the Syrian refugee crisis, or Syrian refugees being on U.S. soil. For one reason or another, even oneness Pentecostals have stated that they neither trust nor desire for them to be here, and that they need to go back or go somewhere else. But this response is nothing new in American history. In fact, Isabel Hilton from Greenville 2010 states that we had a similar discussion during the Kosovo conflict back in 1999. If oneness Pentecostals will continue to claim obedience to Scripture and that this is their defining mark, i.e., in other words, they're being apostolic, then they will have to reconcile any inhibitions with the biblical texts of Luke. So, my thesis statement is that the research I provide seeks to draw from a Lucan model of pastoral care in order to provide a proper Christian community response to displaced persons in North America. I follow very closely with Gherkin's Quadrilateral as my methodology, and I primarily focus on tradition care and Christian community care by drawing from the Lucan corpus in order to show how Luke gave a robust account of a movement that cared for those very different than themselves, as Jesus himself commanded them to do. In this way, I call attention to the Oneness Pentecostals' dedication to restorationism and how various key texts such as Luke 10 and Acts 8 provide sacred spaces for reflection and reorientation toward orthodoxy, orthopraxy, and orthopathy. In this paper, I tie Luke's writings more closely with orthodoxy, and I use Luke's writing in addition to current refugee crises to formulate orthopraxy and orthopathy. I do not only focus on the Syrian refugee, but the contemporary issue at large. So here are some key findings. First, I start with Luke's orthodoxy. If you track through the book of Luke, you will find an innumerable amount of examples, models, and script and text that demonstrate the need and the early practice of the church in fulfilling Christ's commandment to care for the least of these. Most of all, I focus on Luke chapter 10, where two key passages come into play. The second commandment, where Jesus ties the Shema of Deuteronomy 6 with the command to love one's neighbor as themselves from Luke 19, and how he ties them together in response to the interlocutor, the person that was the law expert, the person that was trying to justify themselves and trying to get Jesus to trip up, so to speak. So in his response to what the greatest commandment was, Jesus simply agreed that what this man had provided was actually absolutely the truth. But he goes a step further because the interlocutor begins to justify himself. So Jesus begins to tell the tale of the Good Samaritan. Well, as it turns out, Samaritans were very hated people. And the people that could have provided care for the fallen Jewish man were a Levite and a priest, two members that are to be model citizens of what the law intended for the people of Israel, even though this wasn't a Jewish nation at this point in Jesus' time. So it proved in the end that the Samaritan was the neighbor. So Jesus began to expand the definition of what a neighbor is. Well, another key finding or another key discussion is Luke 4:18, talking about the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and how his ministry was tied together with this idea of providing liberty for those who are oppressed. I also go into, and for further discussion on the second commandment, check out Bach in 1996. Acts 2, as many are probably familiar with, as Keener says from 2012, the early church started with the Jews, but they started from people of the Jewish faith from all over the Roman Empire. So Keener says that it is at least plausible and even likely that Luke had in mind the reversal of the Tower of Babel. But that's significant because that means that the world is coming back under a common banner, in other words, Christ. So for people of various skin tones, of various different cultures, even though they have the same faith, which Christians have never moved away from that idea, that somebody could be of a different skin tone, a different culture, yet would still come together under the same faith. This is something that early Christianity really championed, even though it was a inheritance from the Jewish faith, or rather a continuation of the Jewish faith, if you will. So, taking that idea of a global movement from people of various different backgrounds, we also discuss Acts chapter 8. Now, this has two different parts. One, we introduce the idea of the Samaritans, who Jesus spent significant amounts of time in the book of Luke, but also in Acts chapter 8, Philip goes out of his way and becomes essentially, if you don't include the ministry that happens in Acts chapter 2, becomes the first truly intercultural, cross-cultural, multicultural minister. And he begins to minister to these people that are not purely Jewish, but are also not purely Gentile. And shows a very potent example of what the early church was like and how they began to tear down social barriers. Despite the reasons, now the Samaritans and the Jews go back for centuries in their hatred for one another. And yet the early church accepted such people into the church almost without any question. The controversy was not over the Jews and the Samaritans. It was about the Gentiles. Fast forwarding a little bit, Philip and the eunuch, I spend quite a bit of time unpacking this idea, but essentially the eunuch represents a lot of several different important things. So moving on, we look at Acts chapter 10 and Acts chapter 15. F.F. Bruce actually unpacks the idea from Acts chapter 15 and how that was a glorious event for multiculturalism in the early church. The global refugee crisis, there are innumerable reports on the nearly insurmountable refugee crises. I discovered that defining a refugee is a subject of hot debate in and of itself. According to Bizarrake 2017, the UN reported there are over 65 million known displaced persons as of 2016. This number is second only to those displaced by World War II. Displaced persons include those who are displaced by environmental, including disasters and pollution, armed conflict, and civil rights violations. Importantly, a large number of them, according to Cruz, are also Christian. But this is not a political discussion. Greenhill cites that the moral conundrum facing westernized nations or Western countries who are very apt to accept refugees, how they are actually in a moral conundrum. But this does not take away or detract from the Christians' calling to love others as themselves for those who are already here. So the question is not whether the church should be behind policies that are against them being here, refugees that is, or not. The discussion simply centers around whether or not Christians should be loving to those who are already here, and the answer is a resounding yes. Now, Christopher Wright, 2006, presents a very important distinction between social care and evangelism and how the church is to look at that. His answer simply is that they are two sides of one coin, and if we're going to love people, we have to love them holistically, which involves social care. And he gives some important details on that. Next, I say that the church is uniquely gifted to handle the needs of the world around it. For instance, I cite the fact that according to TESOL, Teaching English to Students of Other Languages, there are many helpful methodologies available that are fairly easy to learn in providing teaching English to, let's say, Syrian refugees who don't know English, because language is power and language is success. The church has the ability already to be able to provide for that. So you have the physical needs like shelter, food, and etc. But you also have emotional needs such as community and such as caring for the trauma and caring for the need for others. which the church is also uniquely gifted to be able to provide. And with that, let's see. I think I also cover how the church itself provides a model of care and provides a model that we are able to take care of such people. We're able to become an answer for them. So if the Gospel of Luke tells us anything, it's simply, in conclusion, that we ought to be loving towards these people. Now, that's easier said than done, but if you look at the world around us and you continue to reflect on various passages such as Acts chapter 8, then you will come to a better understanding of what to do, orthopraxy, such as providing the actual needs. So the church is uniquely gifted for it, therefore they are able to actually do something with the commandment to love. And then the fact that the need is so great and that there are no real excuses for us not to be providing care also addresses some issues of orthopathy. So altogether, according to Gherkin's methodology, his quadrilateral, I focus primarily on the apostolic hermeneutic and the Oneness Pentecostal Christian community, and how our desire to go back to Scripture for doctrine and experience necessitates us looking at the writings of Luke and thus formulating a biblical response. Thank you.